July 1945, the Western Pacific. The sun is a white-hot hammer beating down on the steel decks of the U.S. Fifth Fleet. Thousands of miles from the nearest American city, the humidity is thick enough to choke a man. But amidst the thunder of 16-inch guns and the smell of cordite, something impossible is happening. A Japanese scout, peering through binoculars from a jagged limestone ridge on a nearby atoll, watches a strange, concrete-hulled vessel being towed into the lagoon. It has no massive turrets. It carries no aircraft. Instead, it is surrounded by cheering American sailors, lined up with metal mess tins in hand. Inside that hull, massive compressors are humming, defying the tropical heat to maintain a temperature of 0 degrees. To the Japanese soldier, who has survived on a handful of maggot-infested rice for weeks, the scene is incomprehensible. He is watching the world's only floating ice cream parlor, a $1 million vessel dedicated solely to providing a frozen dessert to the frontlines. In this moment, the war is not being won by a better rifle or a faster plane, but by a civilization so wealthy it could afford to bring a parlor to a slaughterhouse. To understand how a $1 million ice cream barge ended up in the middle of a bloody oceanic theater, one must first look back at the radical transformation of the American landscape in the early 1940s. Before the first shot was fired at Pearl Harbor, the United States was a nation struggling to emerge from the shadow of the Great Depression. Its military was ranked 19th in the world, smaller than that of Portugal or Romania. But by 1942, the arsenal of democracy had awakened, and it was operating on a scale that defied the traditional laws of warfare. The American approach to World War II was not merely tactical, it was industrial. While Germany and Japan viewed war as a test of spiritual will and martial prowess, the U.S. viewed it as a massive engineering and logistical problem to be solved. This mindset gave birth to the Victory Program, an ambitious blueprint that turned every civilian factory into a cog in the military machine. In the Pacific, this posed a unique challenge. Unlike the European theater, where soldiers could occasionally liberate a town and find a bakery or a local cafe, the Pacific was a wasteland of salt water and scorched sand. The distances were staggering. Supply lines stretched over 7,000 miles from the west coast. To keep a sailor or a Marine motivated in 110-degree heat, the U.S. Navy realized that calories were not enough. They needed a taste of home. By 1943, the U.S. Bureau of Supplies and Accounts had begun prioritizing what they called B rations. These weren't just the canned meats and hard biscuits of the First World War. These were items designed to maintain the psychological edge of the American serviceman. Coca-Cola, cigarettes, Hershey bars, and most importantly, ice cream. This wasn't seen as a luxury by the high command. It was seen as a fuel for morale. Secretary of the Navy James Forrestal famously noted that ice cream was the ultimate morale builder, and he wasn't joking. He believed that a soldier who felt cared for by his country would fight with a ferocity that a starving, neglected soldier could never match. The U.S. began shipping massive quantities of dehydrated ice cream mix across the sea. Every major warship was eventually equipped with a jedunk bar, a small soda fountain where sailors could get a scoop of vanilla or chocolate. But for the smaller vessels, the destroyers, the landing crafts, and the minesweepers, there was no room for heavy refrigeration equipment. A gap was forming in the American comfort machine, and the solution would be one of the most bizarre naval vessels ever commissioned. While the United States was busy calculating the cubic footage of freezer space required for a global campaign, the Japanese Empire was operating on a fundamentally different and increasingly desperate logistical philosophy. To the Japanese high command, the very idea of a comfort-based supply chain was a sign of Western decadence and weakness. They believed in satiation, or spiritual power, which dictated that the superior will of the Japanese soldier could overcome any physical deprivation. This was not just a cultural trope, it was a military necessity. Japan's industrial base was a fraction of America's, and their merchant marine fleet was being systematically hunted into extinction by U.S. submarines. By 1944, the disparity was no longer just a gap, it was a chasm. The Japanese soldiers' standard ration had dwindled to a meager portion of rice, often supplemented only by what could be foraged from the jungle. There was no ice cream barge on the horizon for the defenders of Iwo Jima or Okinawa. Instead, there was the long-range diet, grass, roots, and eventually nothing at all. In Washington, the U.S. Navy was looking at the psychological data. Reports from the front lines indicated that psychiatric casualties and combat fatigue were significantly lower in units that had access to regular hot meals and small luxuries. The Navy calculated that to keep the morale of the small boys, the sailors on tiny escort ships and patrol boats, at peak levels, they needed a centralized distribution point for fresh dairy. The result was a marvel of naval engineering. The BRL Barge refrigerated large. These were not repurposed warships. They were non-self-propelled concrete vessels, specifically designed because steel was needed for aircraft carriers and tanks. The most famous of these, often referred to as the ice cream ship, cost over $1 million, a staggering sum in 1945. It was a floating factory capable of producing 10 gallons of ice cream every 7 minutes, with a storage capacity of 2,000 gallons. As the U.S. Navy pushed deeper into the Central Pacific, leaping from atoll to atoll, these barges followed in the wake of the battleships. They were the physical manifestation of American economic power, while the Japanese generals were issuing orders for their men to become shattered jewels in suicide charges. American admirals were signing requisitions for chocolate syrup and crushed pineapple. This logistical divergence was the invisible hand that guided the war's end. The Japanese were fighting for a cause. The Americans were fighting with the full weight of a global supermarket behind them. The floating ice cream barge, often specifically the USS Barnes, though the precise name became almost mythical, was far more than a novelty. It was a complex feat of wartime engineering. The challenge was immense. How to produce, store, and distribute a highly perishable product in the most extreme environment imaginable. Tropical heat and saltwater corrosion were the natural enemies of refrigeration. Yet the Navy demanded a constant supply of frozen dessert for thousands of men. The core of the ice cream barge's operation lay in its massive refrigeration plant. It featured multiple ammonia compressors, capable of chilling hundreds of gallons of raw mix down to precisely 28 degrees Fahrenheit, the ideal temperature for churning. The process began with dehydrated ice cream mix, shipped in vast quantities from the U.S. mainland. This powder was reconstituted with fresh, filtered water, often desalinated on board other support vessels, then flavored with cocoa, vanilla extract, or fruit purees. The churning machines themselves were industrial grade, built to withstand the constant motion of the ocean and the relentless demand of a battle fleet. Beyond production, storage was critical. The barge contained enormous insulated holds, essentially giant freezers, designed to maintain sub-zero temperatures even as the deck above baked in 100-degree heat. These holds were not just for the finished ice cream. They also stored fresh milk and other perishable ingredients that were incredibly rare in the Pacific. The sheer power required to run these plants was immense, necessitating dedicated generators and fuel supplies, resources that could otherwise have been used for combat operations. But the logistical magic didn't stop there. The ice cream wasn't just made, it was distributed. Smaller landing craft and utility boats would ferry the frozen product from the barge to individual destroyers, PT boats, and even to shore parties on newly secured islands. Sailors would line up on deck, mess kits in hand, for a scoop, a fleeting moment of normalcy in a landscape of pure violence. This technological mastery over climate and logistics was a stark illustration of American industrial capacity, turning a frivolous civilian treat into a symbol of overwhelming military power. For the Japanese soldier, the discovery of American logistics wasn't just a military setback. It was a psychological catastrophe. In the final years of the war, the Imperial Japanese Army was governed by the Gyokusai spirit, the idea of shattering like a jewel rather than surrendering. However, the physical reality on the ground was one of extreme starvation. Japanese diaries recovered from the jungles of Guadalcanal, New Guinea, and later Okinawa reveal a harrowing obsession with food. Men who were once proud warriors were reduced to eating leather, tree bark, and in some cases, their own fallen comrades. When Japanese prisoners were captured, they were often brought aboard U.S. ships for interrogation. There, the lifestyle shock was delivered with surgical precision. They weren't met with torture, but with a degree of luxury they couldn't fathom. A captured Japanese pilot, expecting execution, might instead be handed a chilled Coca-Cola or a bowl of vanilla ice cream. To a man who had been told that America was a crumbling, cowardly society, this display of casual wealth was a terrifying revelation. It proved that the United States wasn't just winning the war. They were barely even feeling the strain of it. Intelligence reports from the era note that Japanese officers were particularly stunned and horrified by the sight of the ice cream barge. They realized that while they were struggling to transport a single crate of ammunition to their starving troops, the Americans were using their precious shipping tonnage to transport frozen sugar. One captured Japanese officer reportedly remarked that he knew the war was lost the moment he saw an American task force refueling at sea while the sailors ate fresh oranges. The ice cream barge was the ultimate insult to the Japanese philosophy of endurance. It signaled that no amount of spiritual will could defeat a nation that viewed a global war as a manageable logistical inconvenience. The existence of the million-dollar ice cream barge was not a fluke of local command. It was a calculated decision made at the highest levels of the U.S. Navy. Secretary of the Navy James Forrestal was the primary architect of this morale-first policy. Forrestal understood a fundamental truth of modern warfare. The American conscript was a citizen soldier, not a fanatic. To keep him fighting in the grueling, alien environment of the Pacific, he needed to feel that his government was providing him with the best the world had to offer. In early 1945, when the Navy's budget was being scrutinized for every penny, Forrestal stood his ground on the ice cream issue. He famously argued that ice cream was the most neglected of all morale factors. He didn't just want it on the big ships. He wanted it available for the crews of the small boys, the destroyers and escort vessels that spent months at sea without ever touching land. To Forrestal, the barge was a psychological weapon. If a sailor on a tiny tin can destroyer could pull alongside a barge and get a pint of fresh strawberry ice cream, his loyalty to the mission was solidified. This leadership philosophy trickled down to the admirals. Admiral Chester Nimitz and Admiral Raymond Spruance both supported the logistical bloat that others might have seen as wasteful. They understood that the Pacific War was a war of attrition. By ensuring the American sailor was the best-fed and best-cared-for combatant in history, they were ensuring that the American will to fight would outlast the Japanese spirit of sacrifice. While Japanese leadership was ordering their men to die for the emperor, American leadership was ordering 500 gallons of chocolate mix. It was a leadership style that prioritized the humanity of the soldier, recognizing that a happy soldier is a lethal soldier. The year 1945 marked the definitive turning point where American logistics transitioned from a supporting role to a primary weapon of war. During the invasion of Okinawa, the scale of the U.S. Navy's supply chain reached a level that was statistically impossible for the Japanese to counter. This was no longer just about ammunition and fuel. It was about the sheer, crushing weight of American industrial output. While the Japanese military was forced to utilize kite, human torpedoes and kamikaze suicide planes as a desperate measure to halt the American advance, the U.S. Navy was perfecting the art of the floating base. The arrival of the BRL-2, the concrete ice cream barge, at the forward anchorage of Ulithi Atoll was the climax of this logistical evolution. Ulithi had become the largest secret naval base in the world, a massive staging ground where hundreds of ships gathered before the final push toward the Japanese home islands. In the center of this armada sat the barge, churning out thousands of gallons of frozen dessert. This was the moment the logistics of supremacy became visible. While Japanese radar operators were tracking incoming B-29 bombers, their naval observers were reporting a fleet that seemed to grow larger and more luxurious by the day. The Americans had solved the problem of the Pacific Reach. By creating mobile floating supply hubs that included bakeries, laundry facilities, and ice cream plants, the U.S. Navy had effectively eliminated the need to return to port. They could stay on the offensive indefinitely. For the Japanese high command, this was a realization of total defeat. They were not just being outfought by soldiers. They were being outpaced by a civilization that could manufacture a luxury faster than Japan could manufacture a bullet. The psychological climax occurred not on a map, but in the minds of the Japanese officers who finally understood the scale of their miscalculation. During the intense fighting in the Philippines and later Okinawa, Japanese intelligence units began capturing U.S. supply caches and inspecting the belongings of fallen Americans. What they found was a shattering blow to their morale. Instead of the grim, Spartan gear of a warrior, they found high-quality leather boots, waterproof watches, and small tins of log cabin syrup. But the ultimate shock came during a naval skirmish near the Leyte Gulf, where Japanese sailors managed to board a disabled American supply vessel. They didn't find crates of ammunition at the top of the manifest. They found mechanical refrigeration units and specialized containers for frozen dairy. The realization was immediate and horrifying. The Japanese High Command had predicated their entire strategy on the short war theory, believing the Americans would lose heart after a few bloody setbacks. Instead, they were facing an enemy that had so much surplus energy and wealth that they could ship cold comfort across the widest ocean on Earth. One Japanese junior officer's diary, later recovered by U.S. Marines, summarized the feeling of the entire nation. "We are fighting a giant that does not even know it is in a struggle. While we starve for the emperor, they eat ice cream in the sun." This was the turning point where the Japanese will to fight began to erode from the top down. It wasn't just the atomic bombs or the firebombing of Tokyo that ended the war. It was the realization that American industry had made war comfortable for its soldiers. The ice cream barge was the final, cold proof that the Imperial Japanese Empire was not fighting a military, but a manufacturing monster that could never be stopped. The immediate aftermath of this logistical onslaught was the total psychological disintegration of the Japanese military's core philosophy. For decades, the Imperial Japanese Army had been indoctrinated with the belief that material wealth made a soldier soft, and that the American lifestyle would be their undoing in the harsh realities of the Pacific. But by the summer of 1945, the evidence was undeniable. The soft Americans were not only winning, they were doing so with a vitality and energy that the starving Japanese defenders could no longer muster. When the war finally ended and U.S. occupation forces began to land on the Japanese home islands, the lifestyle shock reached the civilian population. They saw American GIs handing out chocolate bars and ice cream to children. The very same luxuries that Japanese propaganda had claimed were non-existent in a collapsing America. This realization caused a massive shift in the Japanese public's perception of their own leaders. The great East Asian co-prosperity sphere had promised plenty but delivered only ash and hunger, while the decadent Americans arrived with pockets full of candy and ships full of frozen cream. Statistics from the period show a staggering disparity in health between the two forces. By August 1945, over 60% of Japanese military deaths in some sectors were attributed to malnutrition and preventable tropical diseases, while U.S. forces maintained historically low rates of non-combat illness. The ice cream barge, along with the floating hospitals and refrigerated supply ships, had essentially immunized the American military against the attrition of the jungle. The aftermath of this victory was not just a signed treaty on the USS Missouri. It was the total debunking of the idea that spiritual zeal could replace a functioning supply chain. The legacy of the ice cream barge extended far beyond the tropical lagoons of 1945. Following the surrender of Japan, the U.S. military's logistical miracle became the blueprint for the modern global economy. The technologies perfected to keep ice cream frozen in a war zone, advanced refrigeration, containerized shipping, and rapid response supply chains were quickly adapted for civilian use. The cold chain that today allows fresh produce and medicine to travel across the globe is a direct descendant of the Navy's wartime necessity. For the U.S. military, the lesson was clear. Logistics is the most powerful weapon in the arsenal. The ice cream barge became a symbol of a new kind of warfare where the quality of life for the soldier was directly linked to the success of the mission. This philosophy would define the American presence in the Korean War, Vietnam, and eventually the Middle East, where Burger Kings and Subways would be established in the middle of desert combat zones. In Japan, the aftermath led to a profound cultural transformation. The lifestyle shock of seeing the American standard of living didn't just demoralize the enemy. It eventually inspired a generation of Japanese engineers and entrepreneurs. They saw that American power was built on production and efficiency, not just martial spirit. This realization laid the groundwork for the Japanese economic miracle of the 1960s and 70s. The war ended with the sound of guns falling silent, but the victory was secured by the humming of refrigerators. The ice cream barge had proved that while you can fight a war with weapons, you win a war with the industrial capacity to make those weapons, and the frozen treats that keep the men behind them going. The story of the $1,000,000 ice cream barge is often told as a quirky footnote of the Second World War, a piece of military trivia about a floating parlor in a sea of fire. But to view it as a mere curiosity is to miss the most profound lesson of the Pacific conflict. The barge was not just about dessert. It was a psychological monument. It was the physical manifestation of a nation that had become so industrially dominant that it could treat the impossible as a standard operating procedure. History is usually written through the lens of great generals and decisive battles, but the true turning points often happen in the quiet hum of a refrigerator or the contents of a mess tin. The Japanese admirals who dismissed American logistics as a sign of weakness made the fatal mistake of confusing comfort for fragility. They did not realize that a nation capable of building a floating ice cream factory was also a nation capable of building an atomic bomb, a 1,000-ship armada, and a global future. As we look back at the scorched islands of the Pacific, the image of the barge remains as a symbol of the American way of war. It was a strategy that prioritized the human being over the machine, ensuring that even in the darkest reaches of the world, the light of home was never truly extinguished. In the end, the war wasn't just won by the side with the most bullets, but by the side that understood that the heart of a soldier is fueled by more than just duty. It is fueled by the knowledge that his country will go to the ends of the earth to bring him a taste of the life he is fighting to protect.